Before I get started into the subject of this video, I want to play a short 3-minute clip from this podcast I was listening to. It's called Quoth the Raven. It's put together by an economist, an informal economist. His name is Chris Irons. He's doing an interview with Danielle DiMartino Booth. This is his podcast number 203. So again, I want you to listen to this 3-minute clip and really pay attention to what he says. It's at the heart of what I'm about to speak about. And I want to stress the fact that what I believe Chris Irons is pointing out here is that when this information gets to the public, to the average Joe and Jane out there, what's going to happen? And that's really my motivation for putting this video together. I am the average Joe and Jane, and I feel like I've recognized this, and I feel that I've recognized the importance of others like myself, the need for others like myself to recognize this as well. So here's the 3-minute podcast interview with Danielle DiMartino Booth.
That's what we've done here. We've decided who the winners and the losers are. The winners are insolvent, great big companies that can be rescued by the Fed. The losers are solvent, viable, good, strong small businesses who we refuse to give liquidity to because, they have 1099 employees instead of W-2 employees.
Right.
Oh, sorry. That's an asterisk. It doesn't apply to PPP. You're totally fucked. That was 3, by the way.
And the losers are people that get up and go to work for a living. You know,
exactly.
You guys can continue to eat large quantities of shit on a daily basis while the Fed just cuts checks to whomever they want. And it's no surprise that the country really, to me, feels like it is at this time of severe consequence we're at a real inflection point. And I used to say prior to COVID and prior to George Floyd and prior to the unrest that we have right now, but just in the last 6 or 7 years as I've been commentating about these issues, I used to say all the time that if people on Main Street understood exactly what was going on, if they got it, if they understood how monetary policy affects their daily life as a function of how the economy works, and if they understood what was going, just the basics of the economy, the basics of macro, how things are skewed, how interest rate price fixing works, how inflation is a tax on money saved, all of these things, if they just understood, there would be fucking riots. And now, in a post-COVID world and a growingly unruly nation, I think if that would be like throwing a match onto a pile of gasoline if the public really figured it out. I ask a lot of my guests what they think it would take for the everyday guy, like my friends who are mechanics and welders and shop owners and small business owners. What is it going to take for them to understand, Danielle?
Well, I think it's not an easy answer. This is all about, as you rightly point out, financial literacy. And the whole reason I wrote Fed Up in plain English was because it was well past time that Americans understood the role that the Fed plays in their life.
I'm Cameron, and this is the 5000, where I attempt to microanalyze life as a context of history. It's our responsibility to educate ourselves on how the world really works, so we can protect ourselves from what is coming. I hope to convince you that we are in fact losing our country and our freedom. If we want to keep them both, we have to petition the king, and the king is history. I've broken this video up into 2 parts because it's lengthy, but let me get into it now. The revolution has begun. At this point, it does not matter who predicted the coming of this revolution, or whether or not they correctly identified some or many of the causal factors. What matters now is that we acknowledge the situation that we are in this country. Most Americans are well behind the curve in terms of understanding what's going on, so they will need to catch up quickly in order to know how to act. One way or another, we will soon be forced to act. Remaining complacent will not be an option because revolution reaches all doors, and so we will be forced to deal with what unfolds. If we successfully observe the socio-political environment and properly orient ourselves to the level of vulnerability we are immersed in, we can know what decisions to make to prepare ourselves. Finally, we must have the courage and the confidence to act and not hesitate. We must attempt to persuade our family and our friends to align themselves with our defensive position, but we must not waste time trying to convince them, for time is short. We are in the beginning stages of violent conflict. In the coming months, we will watch isolated incidents increase in intensity and frequency. They will be nothing short of terrorist acts claiming to be revolutionary. The social unrest and the random acts of violence that I predict will continue to intensify between now and the upcoming election are the climax of the final days of a 100-year-old monetary system. While there's too much to discuss in a short video, the simple point is that in 1913, the private Federal Reserve was established. This was the beginning of a trend away from a simple supply and demand economy into one of increasingly complex monetary policy that further fostered an environment for crony capitalism. Several key events transformed policy in our country that continued to move us away from free market capitalism and into a 100% fiat or fake money system and socialism that we're now living under. A few of the biggest events were as followed: World War I and World War II, the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed, the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 that created a new world monetary system, as the dollar is the world currency, and reduced the dollar's attachment to gold. And finally, in 1971, President Nixon removed the dollar from the gold standard entirely. This made the dollar 100% fiat and essentially only as valuable as the public believed it to be. Again, I can't go further into detail now about how that has created an invisible form of taxation via inflation, and how the housing crisis, which was essentially a banking crisis of 2008, was used to transfer billions of dollars from the average Joe and Jane taxpayer to the wealthiest 1% investors and corporations on Wall Street. The same is happening now, only it's exponentially worse. And I'm only a layman on these topics, but I have devoted countless hours recently studying what real money is, and wealth cycles, and the history of fiat currency. What I've learned and what I'm now 100% convinced of is that gold and silver have been money for over 5,000 years. The value of every fiat currency that has ever been created has always ultimately gone to zero. All governments eventually abuse their fiat currency and debase it in order to have unlimited purchasing power. They do this by reducing the amount of gold and silver that backs the value of the currency until eventually it's not backed at all. These governments always continue to print more and more currency, which adds to the overall money supply and devalues the currency further. The printing of money is inflation, and the result ends up in higher and higher prices of goods and services. We will all be forced to deal with what will transpire over the coming months and years. Yet I want to believe those of us who have the correct awareness of events as they unfold and also have sufficient means to prepare may be able to secure our life situations enough to subvert the worst of the suffering, but I may be wrong. There are always the lucky ones, but the vast majority will be victimized or forced to defend themselves. So in order to benefit from luck, we must act with wisdom and yet with haste. While this is an unpleasant thought, it is the hard reality, whether we like it, whether we realize it or not. As soon we will not have the option of debate. What we are experiencing is the consequence of a number of compounding factors that would require a variety of experts to explain in many tens of hours of lecture, and I guarantee you they're out there if you choose to go and search them out. But unfortunately, I do not possess that ability, nor do we have the time. Still, it is necessary that I attempt to consolidate these points into a few minutes of discussion so that they will be stated clearly and can be investigated further. Life is complicated. And while that may seem obvious, we fail to miss the gravity of how that statement often congests our national debate and paralyzes our actions to make positive change in our own lives. It is this very complication of the issues at hand that have compounded on our society and thrown us into disarray. We are not at war with each other as much as we are with context. Meaning, very few of us understand our lives in context with recent history that has in turn shaped the current context of our lives. In the case of recent events such as the protests and riots over racism and socioeconomic disparity, coronavirus, economic policy out of control, and political warfare, we must see ourselves in context with recent history. This is not about history repeating itself, and it's not about learning from the past so as not to repeat it. This is about understanding the sequence of events that have shaped the political and economic climate and condition we are living under. It's also about understanding the process of how the psychology of our nation has moved through the decades of the last 100 years in particular, away from ideals of freedom, independence, and personal responsibility to those of entitlement, hopelessness, despair, and dependence. The most important factor that is barely discussed and completely missed by 99% of us is the economic reality that I mentioned previously. It's the actions of the Federal Reserve and the economic policies that followed the Great Wars and the resulting social programs that have distorted reality and spun our country and our people into perpetual debt. It's the removal of the dollar from the gold standard and the existence of a system that is as logical as running the world economy by playing a game of Monopoly. And that's not an exaggeration. Our lives have become a complete game and a total joke to those who set the rules and continually change them or break them at their convenience. We must come to an understanding of this fact, and it must stop. Again, I've come to learn that most all of our problems are rooted in economics. To accurately understand the progression of wealth inequality in our country, we would have to start with the rise of big business from 1860 to 1920. And to be clear, big business alone is not the problem, nor is capitalism. Free market capitalism is the solution. The problem is we have only barely ever had real free market capitalism. As early examples, the railroads and the first ferry systems in 19th century New York were subsidized by the government, distorting the growth of those markets. Excuse me. We could go on and on and on with examples of how the government and central bank involvement have artificially propped up one industry or another over time, destroying the ability of free markets to operate organically. But I think a better way to look at it is this. If, for example, it takes a PhD in order to understand the mechanisms behind making a simple trade between two entities, then the system is designed to disproportionately profit those who write the rules. Basically, the fundamentals of supply and demand are very simple. You and I know them without even thinking about it. The way we make a trade is by transferring value to and from one another. You have something that I value and are willing to trade it to me for something I have that you value. In our case, the trade is usually with currency, which are dollars, for goods and services. The dollar has value to you and me because we expect, in turn, we can trade it to someone else for more goods and services. What has happened with our monetary system is that our dollar no longer has any real value. It used to represent its stated amount in gold and could be redeemed for gold, but that is no longer the case. The reason gold has intrinsic value is because it's rare and has unique qualities that make it a store of value over a long period of time. These remarkable qualities make it a perfect money. According to Mike Maloney of goldsilver.com, it is a store of value historically. It's a medium of exchange, it's a unit of account, it's durable, it's portable, it's fungible, meaning an ounce of gold in your pocket is worth the same as an ounce of gold in my pocket, and it's divisible. While currency, which is dollars, share these qualities, currency lacks being a store of value over a long period of time. Imagine what a paper dollar would look like after some 5,000 years, as compared to gold that does not change. I highly recommend that you check out Mike Maloney's videos on YouTube. He makes excellent educational videos explaining the monetary system. They're very simple and easy to understand, and yet they're very complete. He doesn't leave anything out. He has an incredible series called The Hidden Secrets of Money that relates in layman terms the difference between currency and money, the history of these two, and how our monetary system works. Honestly, there's no more important thing that any of us can do right now in this revolutionary time than to educate ourselves on this topic. I've come to discover that it is the root of all our problems and the only path to a solution in a more free world. And we'll finish there for the second video to come.